My name is Renee, and I'm 58 years old. For years, I cared for my uncle like he was my own father. I managed his medicines, paid his bills, and held his hand through every bad day. He used to tell me, "Renee, when I'm gone, this house will be yours." But after his funeral, a man I'd never met showed up claiming to be his secret son. And before the will was even read, that man was standing in my uncle's living room, talking about his inheritance. That's when I knew something about this didn't add up. For most of my life, I've lived in the same quiet coastal town where the sea breeze always smells faintly of salt and memory. The kind of town where everyone knows whose porch light burns the longest and which mailbox leans slightly to the left. It's the sort of place that ages with you slowly, gently, until you can't tell where the years went. My Uncle Richard lived just 2 streets over, in a weathered 2-story home with blue shutters and a wraparound porch that faced the ocean. The house had been in our family for generations, built by my grandfather's own hands back when this town was nothing but fishermen and dirt roads. Uncle Richard was proud of that. He always said, "This house has seen more life than most people ever will." Richard had been a widower for decades, and he never had children, at least. That's what we all believed. He used to call me the daughter he never had, and over time, I came to see him as the father I never truly got to know. My own father left when I was young, and Richard stepped into that empty space without ever being asked. I never thought of it as a duty, but I took care of him as he grew older. I handled his groceries, his medication schedules, and his endless doctor appointments. I even mowed his lawn when his knees started to fail. In the evenings, we'd sit in his den, he in his old recliner, me on the couch while he told stories about his Navy days or how he met Aunt Laura in a diner one rainy afternoon in 1969. He'd always chuckle halfway through, saying, "Your aunt ordered a slice of lemon pie and told me it tasted like sadness." He'd loved her his whole life, even long after she passed. Our bond wasn't loud or showy. It was built on small acts, quiet dinners, shared laughter, and unspoken gratitude. He trusted me completely, and I trusted him. There was comfort in that kind of simplicity. He often told me he didn't want outsiders touching what the family built. At first, I thought he was just being his usual protective self. Now, looking back, I wonder if there was more weight in those words than I realized. A few months before he died, Uncle Richard's health started to decline rapidly. His voice grew weaker, his movements slower, but his mind was still sharp. One evening, as I helped him into bed, he reached for my hand. His skin felt papery, and his fingers trembled slightly. He said, "Renee, when I'm gone, this house is yours. I've made it clear in my will." I remember that moment vividly, the way his eyes softened, the way I felt my throat tighten. I didn't expect anything from him. I never helped for the sake of inheritance, but hearing that, it was like he was saying thank you in the only way he knew how. After that night, I started staying over more often, sometimes even sleeping on the old sofa in the den so I could hear if he needed anything. The ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs became my lullaby. I'd wake up every few hours to check on him, just in case. One night, when the house was quiet except for the ocean outside, Uncle Richard asked me to sit beside him. His voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "You know, Renee," he whispered, "I've made a lot of mistakes. Things I wish I'd done differently." I asked what he meant, but he just shook his head and said, "Some regrets are better left where they belong in the past." Then he drifted to sleep before I could ask anything more. I remember staring at him in that dim light, feeling a strange sense of sadness I couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear of losing him, though. I knew that day was coming. It was something deeper, a quiet unease. A week later, I found him still in bed one morning, his hands folded neatly across his chest, his face calm, peaceful. I sat beside him and cried, not the loud, desperate kind of cry, but the slow, aching kind that comes when you lose the person who made you feel safe. In the days that followed, I busied myself with the funeral arrangements. I wanted to honor him the way he deserved. The house felt emptier than ever without his slow shuffle echoing down the hallways. I could almost hear his voice every time I walked past the den. People from town came by with casseroles and condolences, each one sharing a story about how Richard once helped fix their fence or lent them money when times were hard. It made me proud, knowing how kind he'd been to others. But it also made me ache, realizing that I was truly alone now. The morning after the funeral, I brewed a pot of coffee and sat by the kitchen window, staring out at the gray sea. The air felt heavy, and my thoughts were foggy. I was trying to figure out what came next, what I'd do with the house, how I'd manage the estate. The lawyer had mentioned that the will reading would take place in a few days, but I wasn't worried. Uncle Richard had been clear about his wishes. That's when I heard a knock at the door. A slow, deliberate knock 3 times. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened it, expecting maybe a neighbor or someone from the church. Instead, I saw a man standing on the porch. He looked to be in his mid-30s, tall, with sharp features and a calm expression that somehow felt rehearsed. His suit was too fine for this small town, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you?" I asked, still gripping the find doorframe. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. "You must be Renee," he said smoothly. "I'm Richard's son." I froze. My coffee cup trembled in my hand, a drop of it splattering onto the floor. Richard's son? He never had any children. At least, not that I knew of. The man didn't blink as he stood on my porch, rain starting to gather on his shoulders like he had all the time in the world. "I'm Richard's son," he repeated, extending a hand I couldn't bring myself to take. "His son?" I echoed, trying to process what I was hearing. "That's not possible. My uncle didn't have children." He smiled, slow and deliberate. The kind of smile that tells you he's already prepared for your disbelief. "Oh, I think you'll find he did. My name's Dean." Dean looked to be about 35. His suit was tailored, dark gray, and his shoes were too clean for someone visiting a coastal town full of mud and salt. Everything about him, his posture, his tone, his easy confidence put me on edge. He didn't seem nervous or grieving. He seemed entitled. I stepped aside but didn't invite him in. "How did you say you knew my uncle again?" "I told you," he said smoothly, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I'm his biological son, the result of a relationship he had in the early 82nds. My mother's name was Laura." That name. My heart gave a strange twist. Laura, the same name I'd seen on those old letters in the attic just days earlier. At that moment, I hadn't yet found them, but hearing it now, it would later connect everything like a cruel thread. I shook my head. If that were true, Richard would have told me. He wasn't the type to keep something like that hidden. Dean raised an eyebrow, pulling out a folded document from his jacket pocket. He laid it on the table beside the door. "Birth certificate," he said. "Take a look." I hesitated, then picked it up. It was aged, creased from being folded too many times. My eyes landed on the name, Father, Richard Caldwell. I stared at the signature. It looked old. The ink was faded, and the handwriting, though similar to Richard's, had something off about it, like someone had practiced his style just enough to fool the casual eye. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice quieter now. He smiled again. "From my mother. She kept it. Richard reached out to me a few months ago. Said he wanted to make amends before he passed. We spoke on the phone. He told me about this house. His tone was so confident that it made me second-guess my own memories. I remembered Richard talking about regrets, about mistakes, but not about children. Still, the timing lined up disturbingly well. "Funny," I said, crossing my arms. "He never mentioned you, not once. And I spent almost every day with him during those last few months." Dean shrugged. "Maybe he didn't think you'd understand. Maybe he was ashamed. Fathers get that way when they realize they weren't there for their sons." There was something rehearsed about his words, too smooth, too precise, as if he'd said them before. He brushed past me and stepped inside without asking. I froze for a moment, then followed, watching as he slowly moved through the living room. His eyes scanned the framed photos on the mantel, pictures of Richard in uniform, of me as a child sitting beside him on the porch steps, of holidays long gone. Feels like home, he said, running a hand along the edge of the mantel. I remember him describing this place to me. Said it was where he always felt happiest. My jaw clenched. You shouldn't be here, I said firmly. The will hasn't been read yet. You have no claim to this house. He turned toward me, his expression unreadable. The will? Oh, I think we'll both find that it settles things pretty clearly. The way he said it so calm, so sure, made something tighten in my chest. I studied him carefully. There wasn't an ounce of grief in his posture, no hint of loss, just calculation. His eyes flickered toward the old grandfather clock, the worn rug, the bookshelves filled with Richard's old novels. It was as if he were cataloging everything, imagining it as his. How long have you been in town? I asked. A few days, he said casually, glancing at the old family portrait on the wall. I wanted to give the family some space before I showed up. Seemed respectful. I almost laughed. Respectful wasn't the word that came to mind. You could have called the lawyer, I said. I could have, he admitted. But this is personal. You'll see soon enough, Aunt Renee. The word aunt hit me like a slap. It was too familiar, too practiced, and it rolled off his tongue with deliberate ease. He wanted me to react. Don't call me that, I said, stepping closer. You don't know me. You don't know anything about this family. Dean tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing with faint amusement. You'll want to be careful about saying that. Families have a funny way of revealing themselves when money's involved. There it was, the truth behind his confidence. It wasn't grief driving him. It was greed. I think you should leave, I said firmly, moving to open the front door. He didn't move right away. He took one last look around the house, his gaze lingering on the painting above the fireplace, a seascape Richard had painted himself years ago. He had good taste, Dean murmured. Guess I know where I got that from. That final line made my blood boil. I held the door open wider. Out. Dean finally stepped outside, his shoes clicking against the porch wood. But before I could close the door, he turned back to me. I'll be in touch, he said lightly. The lawyer will confirm everything. You might want to start preparing yourself. Then, he smiled one last time and walked away, down the gravel path, his figure slowly swallowed by the mist coming off the ocean. I stood there, gripping the edge of the doorframe until my knuckles turned white. The house was silent again, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. The air felt heavier, colder. For a long moment, I just stared at the spot where he'd stood, my mind a swirl of confusion and dread. Uncle Richard, with all his honesty and his stubbornness, could he really have kept something this big from me? I thought of his trembling hand that night, of the way he said he had regrets. Was this what he meant? I slowly closed the door, turned the lock, and leaned against it, listening to the echo of my own heartbeat. The quiet that followed was suffocating. I wanted to believe Dean was lying, that it was some elaborate scam. But part of me couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, there was a grain of truth buried beneath it all. I locked the door behind him, but the unease lingered. What if there was truth in his story? The next few days after Dean's visit felt like walking through fog. Every room in the house seemed to hum with unanswered questions. His words replayed in my head on a loop. You'll see soon enough, Aunt Renee. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on cleaning up the house and finishing paperwork for the estate. But something deep down told me I couldn't just leave it alone. I'd known Uncle Richard my entire life, or at least, I thought I had. But now, every memory felt colored by doubt. What if Dean wasn't lying? What if my uncle had kept something from me, something so big it could change everything I believed about him? To quiet the storm in my mind, I decided to go through Richard's things. He'd always kept his personal papers in the attic, a cramped space full of dust and the faint smell of cedar. It had been years since I'd been up there, usually just around Christmas, to bring down old decorations. The pull-down ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed, flashlight in hand. The air up there was dry and thick, like breathing through old paper. Cobwebs hung from the rafters, and boxes were stacked to the ceiling in uneven towers labeled in my uncle's neat, blocky handwriting. Bills 1,000, 991,000, 999, family photos, tax receipts, Navy keepsakes. The familiar smell of old wood and dust brought a strange comfort, like stepping back into time. I brushed my hand across the tops of a few boxes, leaving clean lines in the dust. It felt like touching memories. But as I started to sort through them, I noticed something odd. A few folders were missing from the labeled boxes, gaps that broke the perfect order Richard had always maintained. He wasn't the type to misplace things. That absence alone felt like a whisper of something hidden. I kept digging, checking under loose floorboards, behind boxes, anywhere that looked like it had been disturbed recently. Finally, I noticed an old wooden chest pushed into a dark corner beneath, a slanted beam. It was covered by a moth-eaten blanket and looked untouched for years. When I brushed off the dust, I saw the faint word "private" etched into the top in faded ink. My pulse quickened. The latch was old but not locked. I hesitated, feeling a twinge of guilt, but curiosity won out. Inside were bundles of letters tied together with brittle string. The envelopes were yellowed, their corners curled, and each one was addressed in Richard's handwriting to someone named Laura. The postmarks dated back more than 30 years. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor, using my flashlight to read by, and untied the first bundle. The letters were written in the same tidy cursive I'd seen on countless grocery lists and birthday cards from him, but these were different. They were intimate, almost poetic. He wrote about his loneliness after Aunt Laura's passing, about meeting a woman who reminded him what it felt like to be alive again. "You made me laugh when I'd forgotten. How," one letter read, "you reminded me that I'm still a man capable of love." My heart twisted. I'd never known Uncle Richard to be so vulnerable. As I read through more letters, a story unfolded. Richard had met Laura sometime in the early 82nds. She'd been younger, divorced, with a child from another relationship. He'd fallen deeply for her, but their relationship had been complicated. She'd left town suddenly, and though he'd tried to find her, life had pulled them apart. In one of the later letters, his tone changed. It was shorter, almost desperate. "If you ever let me meet the boy, I promise I'll be the kind of father he can be proud of," he'd written. I froze, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. The boy. Dean. It had to be him. My stomach sank as the truth began to form. Maybe Richard really had fathered a child with Laura. Maybe he hadn't known until much later. Maybe that was what he meant that night when he spoke of regrets. I flipped through the remaining letters, hoping for something concrete, some admission, some mention of inheritance or acknowledgement. But the last letter, dated nearly 10 years later, ended only with, "I wish I could have done right by you both." That was it. No mention of a will, no mention of property or promises. Just a man's private sorrow, tucked away in an attic no one was ever supposed to see. I sat there in silence for a long while, staring at the letters spread around me like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. My emotions tangled together: sadness, confusion, even a hint of anger. Why hadn't he told me? Why had he kept this part of his life locked away? Then I realized something that made my chest ache. Uncle Richard hadn't kept this from me out of malice. He'd kept it because he'd been ashamed. Ashamed of what he couldn't fix. Of the years he'd lost. Of the man he wished he'd been. That realization softened the anger. Maybe Dean really was his son. Maybe the man had a right to know his father. But did that mean he had a right to everything else, to this house, to the life Richard and I had shared? I gathered the letters back into the box carefully, as if handling something sacred. I couldn't decide what to do yet. Part of me wanted to confront Dean, shove the letters into his hands, and demand answers. But another part of me wanted to protect Richard's memory, to keep this piece of him private, as he'd intended. Still, I needed clarity. I couldn't live in limbo, torn between doubt and denial. So that evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of copper, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at Dean's number on my phone. He'd given it to me during his visit, written neatly on the back of his business card, as if he'd expected me to reach out. I picked it up, hesitated, and then set it back down. What would I even say? "I found your mother's name in a box my uncle hid 30 years ago." It sounded absurd. I decided to sleep on it. Maybe tomorrow, I'd have the courage to confront him. Maybe I'd call the lawyer first. As if on cue, my phone buzzed just as I stood to pour myself a cup of tea. It was a message from Mr. Jenkins, my uncle's lawyer. Renee, we've scheduled the will reading for tomorrow morning. Please arrive at 10 a.m. sharp. Dean Caldwell has been notified as well. My hand went cold around the phone. So it was happening sooner than I expected. All the questions, all the doubts, all the fear they would either be answered or magnified beyond repair. Tomorrow would decide everything. My hands trembled as I held the phone. Tomorrow would decide everything. The next morning, the air felt unusually heavy. I barely slept the night before, tossing and turning as questions chased one another through my mind. By the time I arrived at Jenkins & Associates, the small law firm that had handled my family's affairs for decades, my stomach was tied in knots. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She pointed me toward the conference room down the hall. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud against the linoleum floor. The room itself was exactly what you'd expect from an old-fashioned law office walls, lined with bookcases, blinds half drawn to block the morning glare, the faint scent of paper, ink, and stale coffee lingering in the air. It was a place that had seen too many endings and too few beginnings. And there he was, Dean. He was already seated at the long mahogany table, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. His dark suit looked freshly pressed, and that same smug confidence from the day he'd appeared at the house still clung to him like a shadow. "Morning, Aunt Renee," he said, his tone syrupy smooth. I ignored the greeting, choosing the seat farthest from him but still within reach of Mr. Jenkins, who was arranging a stack of papers in front of him. Jenkins had been our family lawyer since before I was born, a soft-spoken man in his 70s with kind eyes and a perpetual frown etched into his face. When he looked up and saw Dean, I noticed something flicker in his expression. Not surprise, exactly more like discomfort. "Thank you both for coming," he began, his voice low and professional. "I know this isn't easy. Your uncle was a good man, Renee. He cared deeply about you." I nodded, unable to speak. My throat was already tightening. He adjusted his glasses and unfolded the will. "Let's begin." At first, it was all routine. Small bequests to local charities, a few personal items to old Navy friends, even a note about donating his old books to the public library. It sounded just like the man I knew, generous, thoughtful, methodical. I began to relax, if only slightly. But then Jenkins paused, clearing his throat before continuing. His eyes darted toward me, then toward Dean, before he read the next clause aloud. "The house and all associated properties, including the land on which it sits, shall be transferred to my son, Dean Caldwell." The words struck me like a physical blow. My ears rang, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt. I must have misheard him. I had to have misheard him. What?" I whispered, leaning forward. Jenkins repeated the line word for word, his voice trembling slightly. Across the table, Dean's lips curved into a slow, deliberate smirk. He turned toward me, eyes gleaming with a victory he didn't even bother to hide. "Guess he remembered me after all," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear as he leaned in close. I jerked away from him, glaring. "Don't touch me." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his papers. "I understand this must be difficult, Renee. Please know that your uncle expressed these wishes in a legally binding document. I'm only here to execute his instructions." "No," I said sharply. "That can't be right. My uncle told me the house was mine. He said it himself, before he died." Jenkins's face softened, but his tone remained firm. "I don't doubt that, but the will was updated 6 months ago. I can show you the official date and witness signatures." 6 months ago?" I repeated slowly. "Yes," he said, flipping through the pages. "That's correct." My chest tightened. 6 months ago, Richard's health had started to spiral. He'd been weak, disoriented at times, and heavily medicated. I remembered nights when he'd mistake me for my mother, or forget what day it was. And that's when Dean had supposedly come into his life. Something wasn't adding up. I glanced at Dean, who was casually inspecting his fingernails, as if none of this was surprising to him. How convenient, I said coldly. He meets you and suddenly changes his will. Dean didn't even flinch. Maybe he just wanted to do the right thing, he replied. He owed me that much. Owed you? I repeated, the word catching in my throat. You show up at his door after a lifetime of silence, and you think that makes you entitled to everything? He looked at me with that same unsettling calm. Maybe he realized family comes in more than one form. My pulse pounded in my ears. The way he said it, the way his eyes stayed so steady, it made me feel small, like I was losing control of something I didn't even know how to fight for. Jenkins interjected, trying to regain order. Please, both of you. This is a sensitive matter. Emotions are understandable. But I assure you, everything was done according to protocol. I wanted to believe him. But something about the whole situation reeked of manipulation. I remembered Elaine, the housekeeper, mentioning that Richard seemed confused after Dean's visits. I remembered the bruises on his arm he'd brushed off as just a bump. I remembered how tired he looked those last few weeks. What if Dean had pressured him into signing something? What if my uncle hadn't been in the right state of mind? Jenkins continued reading through the final clauses, but I barely heard him. My mind was spinning too fast. When he finished, he neatly stacked the papers, placed them in a folder, and looked up at both of us. That concludes the reading. Unless there are further disputes to be filed, the property transfer will proceed within the next 30 days. Dean extended his hand across the table, mockingly polite. No hard feelings, Aunt Renee. It's what he wanted. I stared at him, my hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles turned white. You have no idea what he wanted. He gave me a smile so faint it barely reached his lips. I think I have a pretty good idea. Without another word, I pushed my chair back and stood. My legs felt heavy, my vision blurring at the edges. Jenkins called after me, but I couldn't stay there another second. As I walked down the hall, the air in the office seemed colder. The world outside looked gray, washed out by the winter light streaming through the windows. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the sea breeze hitting my face like a slap. For a long moment, I just stood there, breathing, trying to steady myself. Everything I thought I knew about my uncle, about our bond, about what was fair, it all felt shattered. But one thought burned through the confusion, clear and fierce. Something wasn't right. And no matter what it took, I was going to find out the truth. I left the office shaken. But one thought burned in my mind: I wasn't giving up that easily. The days after the will reading passed in a haze of disbelief. It felt like my world had been turned inside out overnight. I kept thinking there had to be a mistake, that somehow, some detail had been misread or misfiled. My uncle couldn't have meant to give everything to a man he'd barely known, a stranger who had only just stepped into his life. But denial only carries you so far before the silence sets in. And in that silence, all that's left is the echo of truth. I spent my mornings walking the beach outside my small apartment, trying to clear my head. The sea had always been my refuge, but lately, even the waves seemed to carry whispers of betrayal. Every crash against the shore sounded like his voice. You'll see soon enough, Aunt Renee. By afternoon, I'd usually end up back at the house. I told myself I was checking on things, but the truth was simpler: I couldn't let go. The house had been my second home for so many years that being told it wasn't mine anymore felt like being exiled from a part of myself. Each time I walked through the door, memories would rise like ghosts: Richard humming as he read the newspaper, the smell of his pipe tobacco, the faint creak of the stairs when he'd come down for tea. I'd stand in the den, tracing the edges of his old recliner, and hear his voice in my mind: when I'm gone, this house is yours. Now, it wasn't. It belonged to a man who'd never loved it, never earned it, never spent nights pacing its halls in worry or laughter. One afternoon, I saw Elaine, the housekeeper, coming up the walkway. She'd worked for Richard for over 20 years and knew him better than most. Her presence brought a small sense of comfort, like a piece of the past returning, still intact. "Renee," she said softly, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I heard about the will. I can't believe it." "Neither can I," replied, stepping aside to let her in. I keep thinking there's gotta be something more to this, something I'm missing. She sighed, looking around the familiar living room. Your uncle wasn't himself those last few months. I told the doctor that more than once. Some days, he'd forget what time it was, or ask me where his late wife was. That wasn't news to me, but hearing it out loud still hurt. Did you ever see Dean around here? I asked, careful to keep my tone steady. Elaine hesitated before nodding. A few times, yes, always unannounced. Said he was family. My chest tightened. And Richard, how did he act after those visits? She paused, her brows knitting together as she searched her memory. Different. Dazed, I suppose. Like he'd just woken from a bad dream. I'd ask if he was all right, and he'd just wave me off. Once, I thought I heard raised voices coming from the study. My heart skipped. What did you hear? She frowned, lowering her voice. It was muffled, but I caught a few words. Dean said something like, "You'll make this right, old man." The phrase hit me like ice water. That doesn't sound like a reconciliation, I murmured. Elaine shook her head. No, it sounded like pressure. Threats, even. But what could I do? He was family, at least. That's what he claimed. I didn't want to overstep. I swallowed hard. I didn't blame her. None of us had known what was happening right under our noses. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table long after the sun went down, her words playing over and over in my mind. Dean hadn't come to reconnect. He'd come to collect. I needed proof. The next morning, I began to dig. First, I called the hospital where Richard had been treated during his final months and requested copies of his medical records. As next of kin, I still had the legal right to them, at least until the estate was officially transferred. When the documents arrived, I spent hours combing through them, page by page. The records confirmed what Elaine had said: his health had deteriorated fast. There were notes from doctors about confusion, memory lapses, and possible side effects from medication. On one particularly bad week, the same week the will was reportedly changed, his file mentioned increased disorientation and limited lucidity. If that didn't scream manipulation, I didn't know what did. But instinct wasn't enough. I needed facts, something solid that tied Dean to deception. So I dug deeper. I searched public records, court filings, and anything else I could access online. What I found startled me. Dean Caldwell had a trail behind him, 2 civil suits for fraud, both settled quietly out of court. The first involved falsified signatures on a business partnership. The second, a dispute over forged documents in a real estate deal. A pattern. He wasn't just an opportunist. He was a practiced one. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the computer screen, my pulse quickening. My instincts had been right all along. Dean wasn't some long-lost son reconnecting with his dying father out of love. He was a predator. And my uncle, in his weakened state, had been the perfect target. I thought of the will again, how Jenkins had said Richard seemed quiet that day, how Dean had been present for the signing. The pieces began to fit together too cleanly. Still, part of me hesitated. What if I was seeing what I wanted to see? What if my grief was twisting the truth? But then I remembered Dean's smirk, his calculated calm, the way he'd walked through the house like he already owned it. No, I wasn't imagining it. He had planned this. That night, I returned to the house one last time, standing on the porch beneath the glow of the porch light. The sea wind whipped around me, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and salt. Inside, everything was exactly as Richard had left it, the clock ticking softly, the photos still on the walls, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I walked through each room slowly, almost reverently, as if saying goodbye. But instead of grief, I felt something new building inside me, a quiet, controlled anger. He'd taken advantage of a dying man's confusion, stolen what wasn't his, and then looked me in the eye and dared me to challenge him. Well, maybe I would. Because deep down, I knew. Something for certain. My uncle's signature on that will might not have been voluntary. And if that was true, then Dean's whole claim was nothing but a lie wrapped in legal paper. I had to prove it, but how do you fight the dead man's word on paper? After days of restless pacing and sleepless nights, I finally decided I couldn't let this rest. Grief had kept me frozen long enough. Now anger had taken its place. Anger. And something stronger, a quiet, burning need for justice. I called Mr. Jenkins and asked if we could meet privately, away from the office, away from the polite smiles and stiff professionalism of the legal world. I wanted to look him in the eye and ask the questions I hadn't dared ask during the will reading. We met at a small cafe near the harbor, the kind of place where the coffee was strong and the locals kept to themselves. Jenkins arrived in his usual beige coat, looking older than I remembered. When he saw me, his eyes softened with sympathy, but there was a flicker of caution there, too. "Renee," he said as he sat down. "I was hoping you'd reach out. You've been on my mind." I didn't waste time on small talk. "I need to know the truth," I said. "About that day, the day my uncle changed his will." He exhaled slowly, stirring his coffee, eyes fixed on the table. "I can't discuss the contents of a client's meetings in detail. You know that." "Then tell me this," I said, leaning forward. "Was Dean there?" Jenkins hesitated long enough to answer the question without words. "Yes," he finally said. "He brought your uncle in that morning. Said Richard wanted to make some changes. I didn't question it. People do that near the end." My stomach tightened. "And did you talk to my uncle alone?" Another pause. This one longer. "No," he admitted quietly. "Dean insisted on staying. He said his father needed help understanding the documents. I tried to suggest privacy, but your uncle waved it off." "Did he seem himself?" Jenkins rubbed his temples. "Honestly? No. He seemed unusually quiet. Not confused exactly, but not fully present either. He nodded at everything, but he didn't say much. I assumed it was medication or exhaustion. I sat back, my chest heavy. I could picture it so clearly, Dean hovering beside him, guiding him, maybe even feeding him lines. My uncle, frail and tired, too trusting to push back. "Can I see the signature?" I asked. "Renee..." Jenkins frowned. "You know I can't..." "Please," I interrupted. "I'm not asking you to break the law. I just need to see it, to know for myself." He studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "I shouldn't," he murmured, reaching into his briefcase. "But I don't like how any of this feels. Here." He slid a folded photocopy across the table. "You didn't get this from me." I nodded, grateful beyond words. "Thank you." That night, I spread the papers across my kitchen table. My hands shook slightly as I compared the will's signature with older documents, Christmas cards, insurance forms, his Navy pension paperwork. At first glance, it looked similar, but something about it bothered me. The slant was uneven, the pressure too inconsistent, as if his hand had trembled or worse, been guided. I took the copies to a local document examiner the next morning, a woman named Margaret Dyer, who'd worked in forensic handwriting for over 20 years. She welcomed me into her small office cluttered with magnifiers, lamps, and stacks of files. I explained everything as neutrally as I could, leaving out names where possible. She listened quietly, then examined the documents under her light, her magnifier glinting as she adjusted the angle. After nearly an hour, she looked up at me. "I can tell you this much," she said. "The signature on the will shows signs of tremor and possible guidance. The strokes aren't consistent with natural movement." "Meaning?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Meaning?" she said carefully. "It's possible someone held his hand, or that he was directed where to sign. I can't say it's a forgery, but it's not normal." The room seemed to tilt slightly. It wasn't the smoking gun I'd hoped for, but it was close. Close enough to confirm my instincts weren't just grief-fueled paranoia. "Can you write me a statement?" I asked. She nodded. "I can, but it won't overturn a will. Not without other supporting evidence. You'd need proof of coercion." I thanked her anyway. When I stepped back outside, the air felt colder, sharper. I clutched the paper like it was a weapon, the first real piece of truth I'd had in weeks. That night, I decided to confront Dean. He answered the door to his rental property with that same infuriating calm, leaning against the frame like he'd been expecting me. "Renee," he said, his lips curling. "Come to congratulate me?" I held up the papers. "I know what you did." He laughed, an ugly sound that made my stomach twist. "You really need to let this go. You're embarrassing yourself." "You manipulated him," I said. "You took advantage of a sick old man who didn't even understand what he was signing. You're a con artist, Dean. I've seen your record." His smile faltered for just a second. "You've been digging into my past, huh?" "2 fraud cases," I said, stepping closer. "Both settled. Both involving forged documents." His jaw tightened, though he tried to play it off. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" I said. "Because I also talked to Mr. Jenkins. He told me you wouldn't leave the room. You hovered over him the whole time. You made sure he signed exactly what you wanted." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, not guilt, but fear. A flash of it, quick as lightning before the mask slid back into place. He took a step closer. "Listen, Aunt Renee," he said, his tone turning cold. "You're upset. I get it. But my father made his choice. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can move on with your life. He wasn't in his right mind." I shot back. Dean's smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. "Prove it." He shut the door before I could answer. The click of the lock echoed in my ears long after I'd walked away. I stood there in the dark, heart pounding, the sound of the ocean in the distance. I knew then that I might never win this fight in court, not without undeniable evidence. Dean had covered his tracks too well, hidden behind legalities and timing. But there was another kind of victory. If I couldn't win legally, I could win morally. I could make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of man he was. I could expose him not through lawyers, but through truth. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. As I walked back to my car, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. I clutched the document in my coat pocket and looked back at the house that had once been my second home. I wasn't done, not yet. I planned one final act that would change everything for both of us. It had been weeks since my confrontation with Dean, and in that time, I'd felt both restless and resolute. The evidence I'd found, the letters, the handwriting analysis, the stories from Elaine, none of it was enough to undo the will. But it was enough to expose him for what he was. So, I decided to do what my uncle would have done. I'd face the truth head on. I called Mr. Jenkins first, explaining that I wanted to hold a small memorial gathering at the house. It would be informal, I said, just family, friends, and neighbors who had known Richard for years. He hesitated, perhaps unsure of my intentions, but agreed to come. Then, almost against my better judgment, I invited Dean. If he was going to stand on the ashes of what he'd taken, then he could do it in front of the people who truly knew Richard, the ones who wouldn't be fooled by his polished act. The evening of the gathering arrived with gray skies and a steady ocean breeze. I arrived early, unlocking the front door for what might have been the last time. The scent of old wood and pipe smoke still lingered faintly, as if Richard had never really left. I walked through the house in silence, lighting candles in the den and setting out coffee and pastries on the dining table. One by one, the guests arrived. There was Elaine, the housekeeper, her eyes red but kind. Mr. Jenkins followed soon after, clutching his briefcase as though he might need it as a shield. Then came Mrs. Tully and George, our neighbors from next door, both well into their 70s, both of whom had known Richard since childhood. And then, finally, Dean. He arrived late, as I'd expected, dressed sharply in another tailored suit that didn't quite fit the occasion. His expression was calm, detached, like he was attending a business meeting instead of a memorial. "Nice of you to invite me," he said as he stepped inside. "Didn't think I'd be welcome." "Your family," I replied, keeping my voice steady. It seemed only right. He smirked, but said nothing more. Once everyone had gathered in the den, I stood near the fireplace holding one of Richard's old photo albums. The soft murmur of conversation faded until only the sound of the clock ticking filled the room. "Thank you all for coming," I began. Uncle Richard was a complicated man, but he was also one of the most honest people I've ever known. He believed in integrity, in keeping your word, and in doing what's right even when it's hard. A few people nodded quietly. "I thought tonight we could share some of our favorite memories," I continued, my eyes moving briefly toward Dean. "And maybe remember him not just as a man, but as someone who stood for something." For a while, the room filled with stories, funny ones, touching ones. Mrs. Tully spoke about the time Richard helped fix her roof during a storm, and George laughed about Richard's terrible attempts at fishing. Even Elaine shared a story about him sneaking extra desserts despite doctor's orders. But beneath the laughter, I felt the tension in the air like a current running just below the surface. Everyone knew about the will by now. In a town like ours, word traveled fast. And though no one said it outright, they were all wondering the same thing: how had it happened? When the room grew quiet again, I took a deep breath and said, "Before Uncle Richard passed, I found some letters he'd kept. They were personal, and I debated whether to share them, but I think he'd want the truth to be known." I reached into my bag and pulled out one of the old envelopes, yellowed and fragile. Dean shifted slightly in his seat. "This one's from 1987, I said, softly, unfolding it. He wrote it to a woman named Laura. Some of you may not know her, but she was someone he cared about deeply. I began to read, "You made me laugh when I'd forgotten how. I wish things were different. I wish I could be the man you deserve, and for the boy, the father he deserves too." The room was silent except for my voice and the faint hum of the clock. When I finished, I looked up. Richard wasn't perfect. He carried guilt, regrets, but I believe he tried to make peace with them in his own way. And I also believe that, near the end, someone took advantage of that guilt. Dean's jaw tightened. "Careful, Renee," he said, his voice low. I ignored him and continued, my tone calm but firm. "The law may say one thing, but everyone in this room knows who Richard really was. He was proud of his honesty. He wouldn't have changed his will without good reason, and certainly not under pressure." Elaine lowered her head, tears glinting in her eyes. Mr. Jenkins looked pale but didn't interrupt. Dean rose from his chair. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You have no proof of anything. You're just bitter because the will didn't go your way." "Proof?" I said evenly. "Maybe not enough for a courtroom, but enough for the people who knew him best. Enough to show that he wasn't himself in those final months." I gestured toward Jenkins. Even Mr. Jenkins had concerns about how the signing was handled. "Isn't that right?" Jenkins cleared his throat. I can't speak to the legal specifics," he said cautiously, "but I've reopened a review of the circumstances, out of respect for Richard's integrity." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Dean's face flushed red. "You can't just slander me like this," he snapped. "You're all being manipulated by her grief." "Funny," I said softly, "that you'd accuse me of manipulation." The silence that followed was thick, enough to drown in. Dean looked around the room, searching for support, but found none. The neighbors avoided his gaze. Elaine stood by the doorway, her arms folded, expression cold. "You'll regret this," he muttered finally, his voice shaking with anger. "Maybe," I said, "but I'd rather regret telling the truth than live comfortably with a lie." For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us charged with years of things unsaid. Then Dean turned sharply, grabbed his coat, and stormed out, the door slamming behind him so hard it rattled the glass. The sound echoed through the house before fading into stillness. No one spoke for a long time. Then, slowly, people began to drift out, offering quiet hugs, kind words, soft nods. Jenkins was the last to leave, resting a hand on my shoulder as he passed. "You did the right thing," he said. "Richard would have been proud." When the house finally emptied, I walked back into the den. The candles had burned low, their wax pooling onto the old mantel. Outside, the waves crashed softly against the rocks, steady and calm. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the house pressing down on me with its weight of memories. Instead, it felt lighter, quieter, almost peaceful. I looked at Richard's photo on the wall, his familiar half smile, his steady eyes, and whispered, "It's done now. They know." That night, the house felt different, peaceful, almost like Richard was finally resting. The weeks that followed the memorial felt strangely still, as if the whole town was holding its breath. Word of what happened spread quickly. Our little coastal town thrived on whispers, but no one confronted me about it directly. They just gave me quiet nods when I passed by the cafe or the post office, the kind that said, "We know, and we're on your side." Dean didn't call. He didn't visit. He didn't even send one of his cold, smug messages through the lawyer. It was as if he'd vanished entirely, retreating into the walls of a house that wasn't really his. Meanwhile, Mr. Jenkins kept me updated about the inquiry. He'd promised to look into every angle, every signature, every possible inconsistency. I wanted to believe something might come of it, that justice would somehow swing back in my favor. But deep down, I already knew the outcome. When he finally called, his voice was gentle. "Renee," he said, "I did everything I could. But without clear proof of coercion or forgery, the court can't overturn the will. I'm sorry." For a long moment, I said nothing. I just stared out the window at the ocean, the waves rolling in steady rhythm. "It's all right," I said finally. "Thank you for trying." When I hung up, I expected to feel crushed, angry, betrayed, defeated. But I didn't. What I felt instead was calm. Like something had loosened its grip on me. I realized then that I'd been fighting so hard for something that was never really about the house at all. It wasn't the walls or the furniture I wanted, it was the sense of belonging they represented. The comfort of being chosen. Of knowing that someone saw me as family, as part of something permanent. But the truth was, Richard's love for me wasn't bound to those bricks or those floors. It had always existed apart from them in every kind word, every shared meal, every quiet night spent talking about life. Losing the house didn't mean losing him. So I made a decision. It was time to move on. I sold my apartment and started packing the few things that truly mattered to me. A framed photo of Richard from his Navy days. His old pipe, the seashell-shaped lamp he'd bought me when I was 20. Everything else I left behind. The day I came to the house for the last time, the air was crisp and still. The autumn wind carried the faint scent of sea salt and pine. I walked from room to room slowly, touching the walls, running my fingers over the furniture as if memorizing their texture one last time. The den felt emptier than ever. Richard's recliner sat in the corner like a monument to time. I half expected him to walk in, clearing his throat, and tell me to put the kettle on. Instead, there was only silence. I stood there for a long while, then whispered softly, "Goodbye, Uncle Richard. Thank you for everything." I don't know if I expected an answer. Maybe just some sign, some flicker of warmth in the air. But the only response was the steady ticking of the old grandfather clock. As I stepped outside, the wind caught the hem of my coat, wrapping it around my legs like a gentle push forward. I closed the door behind me and stood on the porch, staring at the horizon. The sea stretched endlessly before me, vast, untamed, and free. That's when I realized that was what I wanted to be too. Free. As I walked toward my car, I noticed a movement in the window above the porch. Dean was there, standing half hidden behind the curtain, watching me. His face was pale, almost hollow, like a ghost staring out from a cage he didn't know he'd built for himself. For a moment, our eyes met. He didn't say anything, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He just stood there, expression blank, as if realizing that victory didn't feel like he thought it would. I almost pitied him. Whatever triumph he thought he'd won, it had come at a price. He'd inherited a house, yes, but also the weight of guilt, of whispers, of a community that would never truly accept him. I turned away. I had no desire for revenge anymore. The truth had already done what it needed to do. It had exposed him, quietly and effectively. The people who mattered knew who he really was. And I was done fighting. I drove into town one last time, stopping by the harbor before I left. The sun was low on the horizon, painting the water gold. I stood there for a moment, clutching the small wooden box that held Richard's pipe and a few keepsakes. Then I opened it, took a deep breath, and gently placed the pipe on a weathered bench overlooking the sea. It felt like leaving a piece of him where he belonged. As I turned back toward the car, the sound of waves filled the air behind me. Not mournful this time, but steady strong. I got into my car, started the engine, and sat for a moment before pulling away. The house, the town, the years, they all faded behind me, swallowed by distance and the promise of something new. For the first time in months, I felt light. No more anger. No more resentment. Just quiet understanding. Richard had given me something far greater than a house. He'd given me the courage to start again, to build a life on my own terms, not in the shadow of anyone else's choices. As I reached the edge of town, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The sky was a canvas of orange and pink, the ocean glimmering beneath it. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was returning to myself. Driving away, I promised myself I'd never let inheritance define my worth again. It's been a year since I left that house behind. A full year of quiet mornings, soft waves, and a kind of peace I didn't think I'd ever feel again. I live now in a small cottage overlooking the ocean, about 30 miles north of my old hometown. It's nothing fancy, whitewashed walls, a creaky porch, a single bedroom, but it's mine, every inch of it. I pay the rent with my own money, plant my own flowers, and mend my own broken things. The sea is closer here. When I open my windows in the morning, the salt air drifts in so easily that it feels like breathing freedom. Some nights, I still wake to the sound of waves crashing against the rocks, and for a moment, I imagine I'm back in Richard's house, before everything went wrong. But then I remember where I am, and I smile. This place doesn't hold ghosts, just echoes of peace. I've learned to love the small things again. The first sip of tea in the morning, the feel of soil between my fingers when I tend my tiny garden, the sound of the gulls calling overhead. Life, I've realized, is not about what you inherit, but what you grow from. Sometimes, I sit on the porch with a notebook and write letters I'll never send. Letters to Richard, mostly. I tell him about the cottage, about how the garden is thriving, how the hydrangeas finally bloomed in late spring. I tell him about the neighbors, a kind widow named Marjorie who brings me jam jars, and her grandson who helps carry my groceries. It feels silly, maybe, writing to someone who can't read them. But it helps. It keeps him close in a way that doesn't hurt anymore. Every so often, I dream of him. In my dreams, he's younger, smiling, sitting by the porch railing with the sea behind him. There's no sadness in his face, no guilt, just warmth. He never speaks in those dreams, but he doesn't need to. I always wake up feeling lighter, as if some unspoken message had been understood. A few months ago, I wrote him one last letter, the final one I felt I needed to write. I thanked him for everything, for his kindness, his flaws, his love, and even his secrets. I told him I forgave him for not telling me the truth because I finally understood why he didn't. He wasn't ashamed of me or of Dean. He was just trying to protect both of us in the only way he knew how. And, strange as it sounds, I forgave Dean too. I never saw him again after that night he watched me from the window. But a few weeks later, I received a letter from Mr. Jenkins. It was short and formal, written in his careful handwriting. Dear Renee, I thought you should know that Dean has sold the property. He moved out shortly after the transaction was complete. From what I understand, he told the buyers he was ready for a new start. I doubt he'll find one quite as meaningful. I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and set it aside. The house that had once held generations of my family now belonged to strangers. And yet, for the first time, that thought didn't ache. It didn't feel like something lost, it felt like something released. I poured myself a cup of tea and walked outside to the porch, watching the waves shimmer under the morning light. A quiet satisfaction washed over me. Some things, I realized, can't be bought, can't be stolen, can't even be inherited. Peace is one of them. It belongs only to those who choose it. As the months passed, I started rebuilding my life in ways that had nothing to do with loss. I joined a small book club in town, started volunteering at the local library, even learned how to make my own bread. My hands, once always busy caring for someone else, finally learned to care for myself. Every now and then, I think about that day in the lawyer's office, the shock, the betrayal, the way the world seemed to crumble in one sentence, and I think about how, somehow, I survived it. Not by fighting harder, but by finally letting go. Looking back, I understand what Richard's regrets truly meant. When he told me that night that he had things he wished he'd done differently, I used to think he was talking about his will, or Laura, or the son he'd never known. But now, I think it was simpler than that. He regretted not being honest sooner, not trusting that I would understand. But maybe, in his own way, he did trust me. He trusted that even if he couldn't fix everything, I would find a way to forgive. And I have. On my nightstand sits a framed photo of Richard, taken years ago. He's sitting on the porch steps, laughing at something just out of frame. Beside it rests the last letter I wrote to him, folded neatly beneath a small seashell I found on the beach. Every morning, when the sun hits that photo, it casts a soft glow over both. It feels like a quiet conversation between past and present, a reminder that love doesn't end with death. It just changes shape. Sometimes, I still wonder what became of Dean. Whether he learned anything from all of it, whether the weight of what he did ever caught up with him. But I don't dwell on it. His story isn't mine to carry anymore. Mine is simpler now, peaceful. I wake early, watch the ocean, and remind myself that this chapter of my life, this quiet solitude, is not a punishment, but a gift. A chance to start again, without expectations, without regret. I spend my evenings reading by the fireplace or watching the tide roll in, knowing that Richard would have loved this place, the simplicity, the sound of the sea, the way the stars scatter so clearly across the night sky. And sometimes, when the wind rushes through the open window just right, carrying the faint scent of salt and cedar, I swear I can almost hear his voice, soft, familiar, at peace. I smile then, close my eyes, and whisper, "I'm all right, Uncle Richard, really." The thing is, he did keep his promise, just not in the way either of us expected. He promised me the house, yes, but that wasn't the real inheritance. The real gift was what came after: the freedom to start over, the strength to forgive, the peace to let go. As I sit on my porch now, the evening sun painting the ocean gold, I realize how far I've come. My life isn't perfect, but it's mine, quiet, steady, full of meaning. And in that stillness, I finally understand. He promised me the house, but what he truly gave me was freedom, and I think that's worth more than any inheritance. In the end, I learned that peace isn't something you inherit, it's something you create. Losing the house hurt, but it also set me free from the weight of old promises. My uncle's love was never written on paper. It lived in every memory we shared. And as I watch the ocean now, I finally understand he didn't just leave me a home. He left me the strength to build my own. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like it and share it with someone who believes that family should mean more than inheritance. And if you'd like to hear more real-life stories like mine, make sure to subscribe. Your support truly keeps me going. Because sometimes, the things we lose aren't really losses at all. They're lessons. Tell me in the comments, would you have fought for the house or walked away for your peace?